A team of archaeologists at the University of Oregon have found one of North America's oldest human-occupied sites in southern Oregon.
A team of archaeologists at the University of Oregon have found one of North America's oldest human-occupied sites in southern Oregon. In a dry cave in south-central Oregon, archaeologists pulled something out of the dirt that should not exist. They sent it to the lab once. The number that came back was wrong, so they ran it again with a different sample on a different machine. The dating came back, then came back again, and a third time, and every result pointed to the same impossible conclusion. Whoever left this was standing on American soil thousands of years before history says any human being was here. And what they unearthed next does not just rewrite the textbook, it burns it. The Oregon Cave. For most of the 20th century, every textbook in America repeated the same neat little story. The first humans to reach this continent were called the Clovis people, named after a site in New Mexico where their distinctive stone tools were uncovered. Dated evidence of tobacco use in prehistory in the Americas prior to 3,000 or 3,500 years ago. They were skilled hunters who shaped fluted spear points, blades with a groove down the center that made them lighter and more lethal. The timeline was clean. They walked across a frozen land bridge from Asia to Alaska around 13,000 years ago, slipped snorts south through an ice-free corridor, and spread across the continent. End of story. That version of events was printed in textbooks. It was repeated in documentaries. It was defended fiercely by the scientists who built their careers on it. And then someone went looking inside a row of dry caves in south-central Oregon known as the Paisley Caves. Researchers had known about Paisley for decades. Nobody had looked closely enough. Nobody had dug deep enough. And when they finally did, the evidence they pulled out of the dirt was not a weapon. It was not a tool.
Dated evidence of tobacco use in prehistory in the Americas prior to 3,000 or 3,500 years ago.
It was something nobody expected. Preserved human waste dried and hardened over thousands of years, sitting in the dirt of the cave floor exactly where someone had left it. The dry desert air had done what no museum could ever do. It had preserved a fragile organic clue across an unimaginable stretch of time. And inside those unassuming chunks of ancient material was something that stone tools could never offer. Human DNA. When scientists pulled mitochondrial DNA from the samples and sequenced it, the result was undeniable. The genetic material matched the Native American founding haplogroups A2 and B2. These were direct ancestors of modern indigenous peoples of the Americas, not a vanished population, not a failed migration that left no descendants, real ancestors of people who live here today. People with families, with names, with bloodlines that stretch back through the millennia and into music, a cave most of the world had never even heard of. Then came the date. The technique was accelerator mass spectrometry, a method that measures the age of organic material directly without depending on the dirt or objects around it. Once calibrated, the preserved remains landed at over 14,000 years before the present. At least 1,000 years before the Clovis people were supposed to have arrived. The Clovis people were not first. They were not even close. And here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. Paisley Caves was not even the first crack in the story. It was just the one that finally broke the dam. The first crack had actually appeared decades earlier on the other side of the country in a sandstone rock shelter in western Pennsylvania. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter sat on the bank of a small stream about 7 miles upstream from the Ohio River, with overhanging ledges curving out from the hillside like a stone roof. One archaeologist later described it as having all the attractions of a prehistoric holiday, the kind of place where ancient travelers would have stopped for the night without even thinking about it. In 1955, a local historian named Albert Miller reached into a groundhog hole on the property, pulled out a handful of dirt, and came up with artifacts that had no business being there.
When the initial excavation started here in 1973, we thought we understood everything there was to know about the first people in the New World. There was a prevalent model.
In 1973, a scientist named Jim Adavaggio began digging into the floor of that shelter, working downward layer by layer. The deeper he dug, the older the evidence became. When the radiocarbon samples came back, humans had visited Meadowcroft as early as 16,000 to 19,000 calibrated calendar years AGO. In July 1980, Adavaggio published the findings in American Antiquity and openly stated that the Clovis first model was wrong. The backlash was brutal. Some accused him of contaminated samples. Music, some ignored the paper entirely. Researchers eventually coined a name for the resistance. They called it Clovis primacy syndrome and described its continued defense as anachronistic and futile. One survey of working archaeologists found that even today only 38% agreed with Adavaggio's dates. Another 38% were unsure. The rest still rejected the findings outright. So when Paisley Caves landed, the field was already cracked. Paisley just made it impossible to look away. And then, about 70 miles from Paisley, in a place place almost nobody had heard of, the next blow was already coming. If you find this kind of buried history fascinating, hit that subscribe button right now, because what comes next is the discovery that has experienced researchers questioning everything they thought they knew. About 70 miles from Paisley, outside the small town of Riley in Harney County, sits Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter. University of Oregon archaeologist Dr. Patrick O'Grady has been digging there since 2011. Found a few artifacts, found a few obsidian flakes, and a ground stone tool laying right here in front of the rim. Rimrock Draw was not giving up DNA. It was giving up stone tools, animal bones, and a timeline written in volcanic ash. The most important clue at Rimrock Draw was a layer of white ash buried in the ground like a marker. Scientists identified it as ash from a specific eruption of Mount St. Helens dated to about 15,400 to 15,600 years ago. Anything found beneath that ash layer had to be older. Anything above it was younger. It was a natural clock baked into the earth by a volcano that had erupted more than 1,000 miles away. Beneath that ash, the team began pulling out evidence that should not have existed. 27 small fragments of tooth enamel were sifted from the soil. One belonged to yesterday's camel, a species that once roamed North America during the last ice age. Another belonged to Bison antiquus, a larger, heavier ancestor of today's American buffalo. Both species had been extinct for thousands of years, and yet here they were buried in the same dirt beneath the same ash. Then came the tool. In the same layer, the team found a stone implement made from orange chalcedony, a glassy form of agate that catches the light. It had multiple working edges, a curved cutting edge, a flat scraping edge, a saw-toothed edge worn smooth from heavy use. Patrick O'Grady later compared it to an early Swiss Army knife. The teeth along its edge were polished from years of work, the kind of wear that does not develop in a week or a month. It develops over a lifetime. Whoever owned it had carried, sharpened, resharpened, used, and used again until finally it was set down and never picked up again. The position of the tool changed everything. It sat about 10 centimeters below the camel tooth fragments, which meant it was older than the animal remains. And those remains, once tested, turned out to be older than anyone had braced for. The lab ran the test once, then ran it again. Both tests pointed to the same window. The camel and bison teeth dated to roughly 21,000 to 22,000 years ago. O'Grady, sitting with that second matching date in front of him, later admitted that it was extremely scary having a single date of material that is that old. He said you do not want to announce something like that without something to back it up. But now he had two samples, two independent tests, and two identical results. The animals at Rimrock Draw had died more than 18,000 years ago, and the stone tool buried beneath their teeth suggested someone had been there even earlier. I thought, holy smoke, we've got 15,800 as a date for the ash. We have teeth fragments underneath that turn out to be camel. And below that we have tool that, probably over 18 and deeper than the ash. These stone tools belong to a category scientists call the Western stem tradition. They have long blades, weak shoulders, and rounded bases. They look nothing like Clovis points. They were made by different hands following different traditions, possibly coming from a completely different part of the world. They predate the Clovis style by thousands of years. Whoever made these tools was not Clovis. They were something else entirely. But Oregon was only the beginning. 700 miles south in a gypsum desert nobody had bothered to map. 61 footprints were waiting in the dust, and the people who left them should not have existed. Ghost tracks in the White Sands. White Sands National Park is a vast field of white gypsum dunes in southern New Mexico. In 2009, researchers walking across the dried surface of ancient lake beds began noticing something pressed into the gypsum: footprints, human footprints. Not just one or two, 61 fossilized tracks left by people walking along the shore of an Ice Age lake music, known as Lake Otero. The prints were so clear you could see individual toes and the curve of an arch. Some were small, the size of a child's foot. Others were the size of an adult moving quickly, almost running. They were the footprints of groups of people, including children, moving across a landscape that has long since turned to dust. A frozen moment in time captured in mud, dried by sun, and buried by someone until someone finally stumbled across it thousands of years later. The first attempt to date the prints came in 2021. Scientists ran radiocarbon dating on seeds from a plant called spiral ditchgrass, found in the same sediment layers as the footprints. The results came back between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. And here's where it gets worse for the textbook timeline. Skeptics immediately pushed back, claiming the seeds could have absorbed carbon from groundwater, making them appear far older than they actually were. Fair criticism. So researchers tested again, this time using a completely different method. They analyzed conifer pollen from the same layers. Pollen is not affected by groundwater carbon. It comes directly from trees that were alive at the time. The new results match the originals exactly between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. In June 2025, a third study published published in Science Advances looked at organic material pulled from wetland mud and shallow lake sediments. 3 separate sources, pollen, seeds, and organic mud, were tested independently. All 3 pointed to the same window in time, the height of the last ice age, when North America was a brutal frozen landscape. In New Mexico's White Sands National Park, researchers have spent years examining ancient footprints. The human footprints at White Sands were found alongside footprints of Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths, enormous creatures that vanished from the continent thousands of years ago. Their tracks crossed the same ground, preserved together in the same ancient mud. For most archaeologists, that was already a career-ending discovery, the kind of finding nobody wants to be the one to defend. But White Sands is 23,000 years old at the outside. There is something else in Southern California that is so much older it makes White Sands look modern. And it was found by accident. Music by men who were not looking for anything. The freeway dig. In Southern California, a routine freeway construction crew was cutting through soil when somebody hit bone. The blade of the equipment stopped. The foreman walked over. What he was looking at was not a rock. It was not a pipe. It was the curved, unmistakable shape of something that used to be alive. Work stopped completely. Paleontologists were called in, and what they pulled out of the ground was the partial remains of a single mastodon, an elephant-like creature that went extinct at the end of the Ice Age. But the bones were not lying there naturally. Something had been done to them, something deliberate. And as the team brushed away the dirt, the realization began to settle in among the people standing around that pit. They were not looking at a fossil. They were looking at a scene. The mastodon bones showed spiral fractures, a distinctive breakage that only happens when bone is still fresh. Fossilized bone does not break this way. Old bone shatters. Fresh bone twists. Someone had cracked these bones open on purpose, almost certainly to reach the marrow inside. A thick and nutritious food source that prehistoric humans valued highly. And then there were the stones. Scattered among the bones were 5 large cobbles, fist-sized rocks that did not belong in the soil around them. Geologists ran the math. The stones were too large and to have been carried there by water. Somebody had brought them. Somebody had used them as hammer stones and anvils. And then, for reasons nobody will ever know, they had simply walked away and left them behind. This is the part that scares the experts. The dating method used on the bone was uranium-thorium radiometric analysis. And every single test returned the same answer. The bones were around 130,700 years old. Read that number again. 130,700 years. In 2017, the journal Nature published the study. The authors were Stephen Holen, Kathleen Holen, Thomas Demir, and Richard Fulagar. Their claim, written in the most cautious technical academic language they could find, detonated through the field. Some kind of human species was already in North America at 130,700 years ago. Not modern humans, not Neanderthals. Something else. Something the existing models do not even have a name for. The mainstream archaeological community has mostly avoided engaging with the Cheruti site. It is simply too radical, too hard to explain, too damaging to the careers of the people who would have to admit they were wrong. So who were they? Who broke open a mastodon's bones in California more than 130,000 years ago, then walked away and left their hammer stones in the dirt? Nobody knows. Nobody can even guess. For a long time, the assumption was Siberia land bridge, one door in. But new evidence from genetics and from stone tools is now pointing somewhere completely different. Somewhere across the open ocean. Somewhere that should have been impossible to reach. A Chinese origin history claims the first American population walked from Asia into North America across a land bridge called Beringia. It was the only door, the only way in. But new discoveries are forcing scientists to ask a very different question. What if some of the first Americans never walked at all? What if they came by boat? And what if they did not launch from Siberia, but from somewhere much farther south like coastal China? And here's the part that should not be possible. The first hint that early humans could cross open water came from a place that should have made the journey unthinkable. The island of Crete in the Mediterranean Sea. Crete has been an island for about 5 million years. It has never been connected to the mainland in the entire time humans have existed. Anyone who set foot on Crete had to get there by water. Not a raft drifting by accident. A real boat built with purpose, capable of crossing at least 40 miles of open sea. A research team led by Thomas Strasser and Eleni Panagopoulou found stone tools at 2 sites on Crete. The tools were not new. They were between 130,000 and 700,000 years old. They resembled tools made by Homo heidelbergensis and Homo erectus, early human ancestors that walked the earth long before modern humans ever existed. Get this. If those ancient people were capable of building boats and crossing the Mediterranean, then the old idea that early humans could not navigate open water was finished. One member of the team said it plainly. If early humans could move around the Mediterranean before 130,000 years ago, they could cross other bodies of water, too. He said the discovery opened the door to reevaluating every assumption prediction ever made about early human migration. Then came the genetics, and this is where the whole picture starts to bend. Researchers studying a mitochondrial DNA lineage called D4H traced its origin back to northern coastal China. The data did not show one single migration into the Americas. It showed two separate pathways, two different journeys made by two different groups in two very different eras. The first wave came about 26,000 years ago. These people likely traveled along the coastline by boat, hugging the shore from China up through Japan and across the Pacific. They were not crossing a frozen land bridge. They were moving from one coastal camp to the next, following the food, following the tides, building tiny temporary settlements wherever the sea provided enough fish, shellfish, and seabirds to keep them alive. It was a slow journey. It may have taken generations, but it worked. The second wave came roughly 15,000 years ago. These people took the land route across Beringia. They are the group most often associated with later migration waves and with the Clovis-era populations that archaeologists once believed were the very first Americans. It now seems they were not first at all. They were latecomers, walking a path that others had already traveled by sea. And here's the part that breaks people. Similar stone tool techniques have been found across China, Japan, and the Americas. The same ways of shaping stone, the same kinds of blades, the same designs of points. This is not coincidence. This is a trail, and the trail leads back to coastal China. So, the neat little story we were all taught, the one that began with Columbus, then quietly rolled back to Clovis, has fallen apart. The first Americans were not who we thought they were. They did not arrive when we thought they did. They did not even arrive the way we thought they did. The footprints at White Sands, the broken bones at Cheruti, the stone tool at Rimrock Draw, the DNA in the Paisley Caves, all of it points to the same uncomfortable truth. The history of human beings on this continent is far older, far stranger, and far more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. And somewhere out there, in the dirt of a place nobody is digging yet, the next discovery is already waiting. So, who were the people who broke open mastodon bones in California 130,700 years ago? Drop your theory in the comments below, because the official answer is that nobody knows. If this hit you the way it hit us, click the next video on your screen, hit the like button, and subscribe to the channel, because the next dig site is already underway. And when it surfaces, we are going to be the first to walk you through what they found.